In the wake of the collapse of the Empire 88, two notable splinter groups emerged, Fenrir's Chosen and the Pure. I contemplated, for a time, which one to do first and eventually decided on the Pure, mostly because I wanted to leave the larger faction last. Nevertheless, the group consisted of 4 parahumans, one of which was their leader Purity. With her still in mind, while she certainly would like to believe that her group was more heroic and more moderate, as in less racist than the original Empire, it's noted by the heroes of Brockton Bay that her group was still evidently very racist. I don't have anything else to say about the organization itself, so let's go down the cape list, starting with who else? With Purity. She is a blaster and mover in terms of official classification, but using some out-of-story knowledge, she is actually a breaker, or more accurately, a breaker. I'll come back to that later, but let us first elaborate upon her blaster and mover statuses. In terms of the latter, she can fly at extremely high speeds. So fast that among the Brockton Bay Protectorate, only Velocity, a speedster, and Dauntless, someone with equipment augmented with parahuman powers, were able to keep up with her. That made apprehending her an issue, which on its own would not be too much of an issue if that were all she could do. However, she also had the earlier noted blaster ability that made her a serious threat. Said ability is kinetically charged light beams that give her a lot of power to work with, to the extent that she has been described as flying artillery, granting her the ability to destroy city buses at a moment's notice, and the ability to demolish multiple multi-story brick buildings in less than a minute. Destructive capabilities aside, there are some related details worth mentioning. 1. To highlight just how dangerous Purity is, she has been compared to Legend, another cape with light-based powers, and more importantly, one of the top parahumans in the world. Though, Legend has been shown to have more versatility with his power. His beams can bend, fork into multiple beams, go through walls, and even take on various additional effects, such as being able to freeze or ignite people. Purity, by comparison, while able to modify the width of her beam, and generate multiple beams from one hand, she was never shown to be as versatile. Now, with the details related to her official classification out of the way, we can finally take note of her breaker classification. In story, whenever Purity needed to use her power, she would glow extremely bright to the extent that she could make people see black spots, even through tinted lenses. Presumably, the Purity probably saw it as mostly an aesthetic choice, serving the purpose of blinding most people who looked at her too long while also allowing her to forego the usage of a mask. Evidently, that bright state was her breaker form, one that she could not hold indefinitely since it was sustained through an internal energy bank. The latter of which being replenished by what else but light, though halogen lights and sunlight seem to be particularly more effective. Sunlight due to a certain observative character noting that Purity's powers were stronger after periods of greater sunlight, and halogen lights due to a close associate of Purity using them on her to help her recharge some energy. In the latter case, it can be assumed that Purity tested out a variety of artificial lights and found halogen lights to be the best. Admittedly, that has no real basis besides the fact that the author specifically noted the use of halogen lights in the relevant scene. Nevertheless, the smaller details aside, Purity was a formidable villain regardless of what her actual classifications were. Moving on, Crusader is a master and a pseudo-mover. His master ability was creating ghostly duplicates of himself and his equipment. Said duplicates could fly and go through inorganic material. The latter detail being an example of a Manton limit that was beneficial, allowing him to bypass armor and any other sort of inorganic blockage while still allowing him the ability to eliminate his given organic target. In terms of the level of control he has on his clones, he had a vague awareness of what they were doing and could give out mental commands. Though how specific he could get with said commands and whether or not he could more directly control individual clones are bits of information that are unknown. Otherwise, his clones did have some level of autonomy. To what extent, who knows. In terms of their ability, they are, quote, immune to any strike or bullet, as stated by Crusader. Additionally, based on presented information, they are more than capable of pushing people, strangling people, and acting as foot soldiers. To refer back to that pseudo-mover rating, essentially, he has one of his clones overlap him, which give him a limited form of flight. It does not seem to be particularly fast or maneuverable, but it has its uses. As a side tangent, while we don't know what Crusader's ghostly cones are, Skitter had some ideas, such as telekinetic energy infused with fragments of his ego, or semi-sentient force fields molded into his shape. Both relatively interesting and unconfirmable, but still, they certainly give one a nice topic to theorize about. As a final relevant note, Crusader utilizes a spear, with one at one point being 10 feet / 3 meters long. The next person is Knight. She is a breaker, though Changer is an applicable alternative. When not being directly observed by conventional sight, she becomes a durable monster with enhanced speed and strength. Durable enough to be described as having a, quote, nigh invincible exterior, fast enough to be described as, quote, lightning quick, to the point that she briefly fooled someone into thinking that she was teleporting, and strong enough to both overwhelm bitches amped up dogs and break through the ladder's bone armor. Her monster form also had insectile legs, along with sharp claws, though seemingly not quite sharp enough to get through Skitter's silk bodysuit. Shifting focus more on Knight's monster form itself, it has been described as a constantly shifting ink blot with some sort of smooth/oily lubricant coating its exterior. The earlier noted legs did not seem to have any definite structure, with them being able to bend, turn inside out, and stretch out at will. Additionally, by Skitter's own account, through her insects, she was not able to identify any sensory organs, though that does not mean that there aren't any. They could just be hidden well or do not at all resemble what a typical sensory organ looks like. Knight's monster form also seems to be able to sustain some unknown level of water pressure, in addition to not requiring any air. However, she may also just require significantly less air. In either case, when Knight spent an unknown amount of time hiding underwater, she showed no visible physical issues doing so when she exited said water. Moving on from that, another important aspect to note about Knight's breaker form is that when she shifts into said form, she is healed to a pristine state. I'll note that I am uncertain if reverting back into her human form heals her too, since whether you look at the spoiler-free description or the in-depth description of her, it seems like only the transformation into the monster is what heals her. Fair enough if she is healed reverting back to human and I just missed the information, but from what I can discern, it's maybe a case of people dealing insufficient damage to her while she is a monster, so when she turns back into human, she appears as if she had healed when in actuality, she is just maintaining the state she was in when she initially transformed. Thus, the illusion that reverting heals her when it's actually the monster transformation itself, if that makes any sense. Admittedly, not the most optimal explanation. I suppose I'm arguing semantics, since regardless of if it's one or the other or both, she is still healed at some stage of her power. 2 more quick notes about her monster form. 1, it is unknown how long she can stay in said form, and 2, conventional sight does seem to only mean eyeballs, since at least when Skitter was looking and feeling through her swarm, that did not cause Knight to revert. Assumingly, digital viewing may count, but that is, well, an assumption. While on the topic of sight, this counts as a case where it would be pertinent to know what Knight keeps on their person. As one can imagine, much of it relates to items that can obscure sight, such as flashbangs, smoke grenades, and a large cloak. Said cloak could be removed and was lined with many hooks, making her cloak act as a difficult to remove net of sorts that also blocks her target's sight. I have nothing else to say about Knight, so let's move on to our final cape, Fog. He is a changer, stranger, shaker. No, breaker is an applicable alternative to changer, and while on the subject, he was more specifically classified as a shifter in story, but as stated in other videos, that older classification is generally interchangeable with changer. Anyway, Fog's main power is the ability to turn into living mist that erodes living matter. He can choose the solidity of his mist and how much of him is turned into said mist. The Shaker and Stranger classifications are relevant subclasses to his main power. While the most damage one can sustain is within the mist, regardless of how solid he wants his mist form to be, he is still mist. So that ability to erode living matter is still present outside his main, if you want to call it that, fog body, within a certain radius. That's the Shaker classification. As for the Stranger classification, one can see how turning into a mist can lend itself to some degree of stealth or infiltration. There's not much else to say about Fog's power, but I do want to emphasize how severe it is to inhale his mist. While we may not have a human to reference, when Angelica, with no bitches dogs, inhaled Fogg's mist, she suffered extreme internal damage. Even with the regenerative effects of Bitch's power, 2 years onwards from the incident, Angelica was still never able to move properly again. Okay then, I'm finished with the main topic of this video, but I want to do a bit of extra explaining in regard to Knight and Fogg's classifications. I noted that Knight could have been considered a changer instead of a breaker, and how Fogg could have been a breaker instead of a changer. That stems from a mixture of information confusion and some later comments from the author of Worm in relation to said confusion. When Knight and Fogg's official classifications were first shown, it was uncertain which one was the breaker and which one was the changer. Later on, the author did describe Fogg as the breaker. However, later from that, he noted that Knight was the breaker and that Fogg was the changer. Further still, he noted that both could be breakers. So, yeah. All that said, as noted by others, this can be considered an example of how the PRT's classification system is a bit loose in free form, and as such, we at times get powers that can be classified into multiple categories depending on how one analyzes them. More importantly, as noted by the author, it shows how the PRT is working with incomplete information. While from a reader perspective, we may know certain aspects about a given power, the PRT may not. As such, they may give shaky/inaccurate classifications, especially when it comes to a parahuman's classification rating. Anyway, outside the things relating to the Empire 88, I want to go on an unrelated tangent for the last part of this video, so if all you wanted was information about the Pure, this is the time to go. Regardless, if you are staying, I want to mention how I find myself more and more willing to alter or exclude certain information presented in the wiki, for the simple fact that some statements reference sources I find a little shaky, or the presented information feels a bit like wild conjecture/inferences that, while I can see where they may have gotten the idea, especially after looking at their sources, or after doing my own thinking, I still find them to be not accurate to the information presented in their source. Fair enough, I may not always do my due diligence and end up including quote banned information, especially in my earlier videos, and even more recent videos now that I think about it. But I like to think I've been more and more thorough as I make more videos. Though, despite my statements about conjecture and inference, I do acknowledge that I do a fair bit of speculation myself. But once again, I also like to think that the way I word things do generally indicate when what I'm about to say is more along the lines of me thinking about the topic rather than reporting on it, if that makes any sense. Nevertheless, there is reasons why I at times encourage people to question my information. I do think by the time I end up finishing a video that the presented information is correct, in the broad sense. But bits of inaccuracy, misinterpretation, and misinformation unfortunately sneak their way in here and there. Anyway, next up is Fenris Chosen. That may be a bigger video. I don't know. Have not done the research yet. Until next time.